Whew, two people. Test 1, 2. Well, it looks like a couple of people are on already. I started the feed early so that people could join it early, as a couple of you already have. The actual live reading will start at 7. So thanks for coming in early, and stick around, and we'll wait and see how many more people show up. By the way, if you can hear this all right, if everything sounds all right, looks all right, you might leave me a message on the chat function on the video and just let me know, can you hear me all right? Does everything look good? I didn't do my makeup, so I'm feeling kind of nervous. Thank you, Joe. Glad to see you joining me from Kirksville. I feel like I should have had some elevator music playing or something. I obviously wasn't going for top-notch production quality with this. Incidentally, some of the old features on the YouTube streams I was used to, I could have done more with this, but this one's a little more stripped down. I imagine I'll say this again once we get going, but for those joining the stream, I have, and I'm excited to say, I'm a little nervous to say, honestly, I've started uploading podcast episodes to a few podcast sites. So far, it is in the process of being uploaded, I guess I can say, to Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. And some of those say that they take days or even weeks before the podcast will actually appear. I began this process Monday night, so I think it is already available on Stitcher and or Spotify, and I assume in the coming days we will see it on some of those others. But again, so far I've started uploading it to Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. Running into some issues with Apple. I've always found Apple to be counterintuitive. Maybe there's something wrong with me, but if I get that figured out, I'll obviously be updating people. I thought that might be the case, Joe. Thanks for checking. Glad to see a couple more people joining. As the note says on the side, I just wanted to start the feed early for people joining early so they would know they're in the right place. Low production quality with this was really just kind of an informal read tonight, and some of the tools I was used to YouTube having for their live streams aren't available anymore. So I'm sorry I don't have any music or anything pretty for you to look at until I get rolling, but the live read will start at 7, so you haven't missed anything, and thanks for coming. I confess, I don't know who that is. I'm guessing that's Wendy Turner, but I love the username. Maybe I shouldn't say your name on the live feed. Sorry. I'm trying to tell from the photo, but it's tiny on my screen. I'm assuming that those of you logging in now are not seeing this half-hour early login time. I hope it doesn't start you from the beginning. I didn't think about that until just now. If so, hopefully you can fast forward or just come back after the whole thing is finished and posted. Sorry about that. Okay, well, that seems to answer that question. Thank you. Just a couple more minutes. I might wait like an extra minute or two just for any last minute logins or internet hiccups for anybody. See, I went from 6 to 9. I can tell people are having some internet issues. After this posts, I'll lop off this half hour, so if anybody goes back to watch it again, you won't have to sit through this nonsense. I appreciate you checking, Joe. Like I said, hopefully you'll be up in the next few days. This is all a learning curve for me. Didn't you launch a podcast, Joe? Did you have these same kinds of issues? Good evening, Mr. Matt. Thank you for joining us. I've seen a few numbers come and go, so I'm going to give just an extra maybe minute or two here for anybody who's having internet problems or logging in, and we'll get rolling. I promise not to keep you waiting too long. Ouch. Sorry, I had to mute the microphone there for a minute while I busted my elbow on this cabinet behind me that you all can't see. Had to keep this PG-13. Ow. I'm going to give it about one more minute. Okay, I think that's long enough. Well, I've got a whopping 9 viewers, and hopefully more people will watch this after I post the whole thing later. Thank you to the 9 of you who have chosen to join me tonight. I'm going to kind of wing this. It's just kind of a live read among friends, and I'm just going to kind of have fun with it. Obviously, the final product, the podcast, will be a little more polished, a little more produced. It will have some music to it. Thank you to Matt Tebow for helping me get that recorded and ready. And a little update on that. I have started as of Monday uploading my podcast to a few podcast sites. I've had some trouble with Apple's upload, iTunes or whatever they're calling it now, and I'm still trying to figure that out. Personally, I've always found Apple to be a little counterintuitive, but if I get it up there, obviously I'll keep updating on that. But I am in the process, shall we say, of uploading the podcast as of Monday to Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. Now, as far as I know, it's not appearing on any of those yet. Every one of these sites has a different number of, it might be hours, days, they say, or even one said 4 to 6 weeks before it'll appear. But I started the process Monday of uploading the podcast. So in theory, over the next few days and weeks, it will start appearing on those services. So again, so far, you should be able to find it at some point soon on Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. And I'm going to keep working on Apple. Kay, welcome to the broadcast. Unfortunately, I'm not doing Bertha's episode tonight. I hope you're not too disappointed by that, but I'm glad to see you on board anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and get rolling. And as I said, when we have the podcast up and loaded, it'll sound a little different from what you're going to hear tonight. But like I said, I'm just going to have some fun reading this for some friends, and I appreciate you all joining me. So we're just going to get right into the story. And as far as I know, by the way, none of you know what story I'm reading tonight, so this will be a surprise. We'll see how quickly you spot it. A couple of you might recognize it. And I know a couple of you have previewed this for me to make sure that the audio sounded good and everything. But some of you won't know what this story is until I get into it, so let's do that. The afternoon of Friday, February 16th, 1968, was a typical late winter Friday afternoon in Moberly, Missouri. It wasn't quite cold, but not quite warm. There was no precipitation falling, but it was a gray, dreary day. Most of the residents of the north central Missouri town were just going about their usual Friday routines. Many children were just getting out of school. Many adults had only another hour or two remaining between them and their weekend. Things would soon begin to get busy in the 100 block of Reed Street, one of Moberly's hubs of activity. This block was known as the Levee. It had, for a generation or more, been home to several taverns, hotels, and pool halls. Residents say one could get just about anything at the Levee, particularly if one was after a drink, drugs, or a companion for the night. Looming over its brick storefronts from the end of Reed Street was the city's Union Station, a monument to the importance to the town of the railroad. Passenger and cargo trains made for a steady stream of commerce and a steady stream of customers for places like the Levee. Some say one of the rowdiest bars in the 100 block of Reed Street in Moberly was the Randolph Tavern. When new owners took it over, they knew it had a reputation for lots of fights, lots of arrests, and lots of criminals hanging around. They were cautioned to run a clean operation. That's what they planned to do when they opened for business just a week ago. That afternoon, a man walked into the bar and ordered a beer. The answer from behind the bar was no. His name was among those posted on the wall of people who could not be served. Some of the customers that afternoon were his friends, and he asked one of them to buy him a beer. They also refused, if only to avoid getting on the bad side of the owners who were trying to keep the place from living up to its wild reputation. The man walked outside. Here, he carried on a conversation with one of his friends from inside the bar, a woman he had known for some time. Finally, frustrated, he left. People in the Randolph paid little attention. Many of them didn't even notice when sometime later he returned. A few noticed when he stepped inside the front door and immediately began sloshing the contents of a 5-gallon bucket onto a wall, the floor, and a coin-operated bowling machine. A couple more looked up just in time to see him take the matchbook out of his pocket. He struck a match, dropped it, and ran out the door as the gasoline ignited. He left 16 people, 10 men, 5 women, and 1 baby to their fates. This is Show Me Murder. Welcome to Show Me Murder. I'm your host, Michael Lear. For any of you on the program who don't know who I am, I worked in radio news for 19 years, and for the past 9 years, I've been a tour guide at Missouri State Penitentiary. I decided to do this podcast out of my love of history and my radio background, and I want to approach each case as I did the news stories I covered, as well as from the perspective of an amateur historian. For their help in this episode, I want to thank Joyce Campbell, Joe Barnes, and the rest of the staff at the Randolph County Historical Society, the Missouri State Archives, and Jennifer Carter Dockler and the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more, and I mentioned this a moment ago, I have started just in the last few days uploading this podcast to various sites, and so far as I know, it doesn't appear on any of them yet, but over the next few days and weeks, you should be able to find it on Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn, and I'm working on Apple. As soon as I get it uploaded there, you'll be able to find it. So again, you can hopefully find it soon on Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. And you can find social media sites on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by the name Show Me Murder. I hope you'll interact with me. Maybe you can even suggest some Missouri cases for potential future episodes. And if you haven't already, I hope you'll come take a tour with me at Missouri State Penitentiary. And now back into the story. It is no exaggeration to say that Moberly owes its very existence to the railroad. It was platted by a railroad at a site where several lines would cross. Railroad companies saw the creation of towns as a way to control and populate the areas along their lines, as well as to provide businesses to support the farmers and workers who would grow the products their trains would ship. Many towns were created and some prospered while others dwindled and failed. Moberly succeeded because of its position as a junction and a stopping point. Not only did trains and goods from throughout the country pass through, but often it was where the trains stopped to switch crews or make repairs, so passengers and workers often stayed a night or longer. Once businesses and residents began moving to the town, it grew quickly, going from a single man in 1860 to a town of 1,500 in 1870 to more than 6,000 by 1880. By 1920, it was nearing 13,000 residents and has hovered near that mark ever since. Its rapid growth earned it the nickname the Magic City because it, quote, sprang up almost overnight as if by magic. The growing population provided plenty of customers for a variety of businesses, including the usual things like machine shops, carpenters, doctors, barbers, and restaurants. The local residents, combined with the steady stream of transient customers like traveling salesmen and railroad workers, supported those as well as things like bars, pool halls, liquor stores, and, yes, brothels. In fact, Moberly was famous nationally and perhaps beyond for its brothels. The most popular of these was the Sycamore, despite the fact that it operated for decades largely by not drawing a great deal of attention to itself. It was one of the town's several bawdy houses, as they were often called in the 1800s and early 1900s, but it wasn't the only place sex workers could be found. Many times they could be seen walking around the 100 block of Reed Street. This was the block that became known as the levee. Now, growing up in Moberly, this term confused me, as I thought of a levee as being an embankment overlooking a river, and this levee wasn't even elevated. But I have found a couple of possible explanations. A more archaic definition of levee was a formal reception of visitors or guests. Well, this was the first block right in front of the depot, and its businesses were the first people saw as they were entering the town after disembarking from a train. The more likely explanation, though, is that in the 19th century, the term levee emerged as a slang for a part of a city where vices were known to be served. One might think of it as a near synonym for a red light district. People weren't always pleased by what they saw in the levee. In addition to the presence of sex work, there were fights, drunk people staggering about, people catcalling, and other behaviors that were generally frowned upon by the conservative and often religious-minded people, particularly in a small Midwestern town in the early and mid-1900s. Women in particular made complaints to local officials about what they were subjected to and witnessed to as soon as they got off the train in Moberly. More than once, local organizations, including a women's temperance group and city pastors, spearheaded efforts to clean up the levee. Those running for local office would make it a focal point of their campaigns. Local enforcement would make some threats, some arrests, fines would be issued, and occasionally jail time would be assessed, and before long the levee would return to operating much as it had before. This was still the case in the 1960s, though perhaps not to the extent it had been in the earlier decades. In fact, when I was preparing this episode and looking for people who remembered these events and places, I was told about the levee, women simply don't go down there, and that parents didn't allow their children to go down there. As a kid, I heard people talk about the levee, and sometimes the context would give me an idea that it was a rough place, but generally they wouldn't elaborate on what the place had been or even where it had been. When I finally learned that the levee had been the 100 block of Reed Street, it was still difficult to picture, largely because that's where City Hall sits today. Everything that had been the levee was torn down before anything I could remember. But in 1968, it was still a place where many women didn't go, and parents didn't want their children to go. By then, it was in its final throes, with 8 of its buildings listed as vacant. There were a couple of hotels, a cafe, a liquor and tobacco store, and a couple of bars and a pool hall. One of the most notorious destinations on the levee was the Randolph Tavern on the ground floor of the Randolph Hotel. For years, it had been considered a hangout for criminals and had been the scene of many fights and arrests. By the end of 1967, it was under new ownership, and the new owner was making an effort to clean the place up and improve its reputation. The interior had been redecorated, and the city authorities had been promised there would be restrictions on who could enter. Specifically, those with prison records weren't allowed. The list of banned individuals was hung in plain sight. One of the names on that list was William Coleman. William Coleman, better known as Bill, was fairly well known in Moberly. At 6'2", he was tall and lanky. He generally wore his dark hair in a crew cut and could often be seen displaying an affable smile, bookended by ears that stuck far off the sides of his head. Many who remember him remember that his arms and hands were covered in tattoos. Coleman had been born in nearby Cairo, and if you're watching from out of state, that's how we pronounce it in Missouri, in 1932. He was described as good-natured, known to often cut up and smile, and had quite a few friends, including many who frequented the levee. In fact, he and his wife had helped clean up and renovate the Randolph Tavern, and she had worked there. He was also described by local law enforcement as a troublemaker, and he had a long criminal history. During his numerous prison stints, he was evaluated more than once by state psychiatrists, one of whom diagnosed him as having a sociopathic personality, as a person who adds or detracts from the truth to put themselves in a good light. Coleman's parents divorced in 1945 when he was 12. His mother wrote at the time that he was, quote, becoming more and more uncontrollable for me, and told the judge that she thought it would be better if his father had custody of him. Authorities later called the divorce nasty and said they didn't think Coleman lived with either of his parents after it was finalized. Quote, he just bounced, one sheriff recalled. 3 months after his mother wrote that she couldn't control him and his father should take him, Coleman was in juvenile custody. He became a ward of the court after breaking into a tavern and a grocery store. Then in 1946, he broke into a drugstore and was sent to the Missouri Training School in Boonville. He was sent there for a second time in 1948 for burglary and larceny. He escaped and was caught and returned. Then in 1950, he was sent to the Algoa Intermediate Reformatory near Jefferson City, the state's second oldest prison for delinquency. While there, he was prosecuted for assaulting a guard. It was for that assault and for stealing a car he was sent at the age of 19 to Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, the state's oldest and maximum security prison with buildings dating back as early as 1868. It would be his first of several trips to MSP, better known as the Walls. Now, while there, he participated in the prison riot of September 22, 1954, in which 4 inmates were killed and numerous prison factories and facilities were damaged or destroyed. About $5 million worth of damage was done, and it is easily the best known and best documented of the prison's numerous riots. Coleman later testified that during the riot, he and several other men used a sledgehammer to, as he put it, bust down a door in B Hall. His sentence was extended 2.5 years because of his participation. He did another stint at MSP for breaking and entering and was released in 1961. Then in 1963, while under arrest for grand larceny, he escaped from the old Randolph County Jail in Huntsville. And the jail in those days was more or less a house which included living quarters for the sheriff and his family, offices for the business of the department, and cells for holding inmates. In all, he would escape from that jail 3 more times and had 8 total escapes from custody on his record by 1968. One of the most famous photos of Coleman was published after his 1963 escape from the jail. He is seen with a rabbit, which he had kept as a pet while in the jail and, by some accounts, had taken with him when he escaped. In 1966, when he was out of prison on parole, Coleman met a 21-year-old woman, 13 years his junior, and she was in the process of divorcing her husband. The two quickly formed a relationship, and by September of that same year, they were married. Now, I will mention here off the cuff that I know her name, and I'm choosing not to use it for reasons that will become apparent later in the story. Law enforcement thought this marriage calmed Coleman somewhat from his previous pattern of behavior. They settled down in Moberly, and Bill got a job while his wife worked at the 112 Club, another of the bars on the levee. In late 1967, they moved to Macon, about 25 miles north of Moberly, where they lived in an apartment, and Coleman got a job with a construction company. Around the first of the year in 1968, Coleman stopped showing up for work. Not long after that, said the couple's Macon landlord, his wife stopped coming to the apartment. By some accounts, she was seen at some of her old haunts and workplaces on the levee during the 3 weeks leading up to February 16th, and Bill wasn't around. Then on the morning of the 16th, Coleman showed up at the Pastime Tavern across the street from the Randolph. The owner noted that while Coleman normally sat toward the back, on this day he sat in the front near a window drinking a beer and watching the street and passing cars. He left and returned to the Pastime several times, each time keeping an eye on the street. At least once Coleman asked whether his wife had been around. The owner said she hadn't, and said she wasn't allowed in the Pastime until she and Bill reconciled because he didn't want any trouble in the bar. At around 3 p.m., Coleman went to the Randolph. He ordered a beer and was refused service, then asked one of his friends sitting in the bar to buy him a beer, but they also turned him down. Then he asked a friend to come outside. 29-year-old Barbara Cribbs was more a friend of Bill's wife than of his. No one knows for sure what the two of them talked about, but Coleman likely asked her where his wife was. By some accounts, Cribbs told him that his wife had been at a bar in nearby Huntsville. Then after Coleman left, she walked back into the tavern, and whatever she said to her fellow patrons, she slammed her fist on the bar while saying it. Just before 4 p.m., Coleman returned to the tavern with the gasoline he'd bought at a nearby filling station. He was carrying it in a 5-gallon grease bucket. One witness, 24-year-old Vivian McSparran, said the gasoline looked like dirty water, having mixed with whatever else had been in the bucket, so at first she didn't realize what it was. 16 people were in the bar. McSparran sat on a stool near the entrance with a 2-year-old baby she was watching. A couple of men, 46-year-old Virgil Hill and 70-year-old Charles Buckler, were seated at the bar, having bought one another a couple of rounds. One of them was just about to get up and go toward the back to visit another friend. Coleman never said a word as he stepped inside the tavern's open front door and swung the bucket in a wide arc. He slung it once or twice more before throwing the bucket toward the back of the bar, where it landed with a loud clang. He lit a match, dropped it under the gasoline, and left. He'd been in the bar fewer than 10 seconds. The gas ignited with an explosion. People were thrown from their bar stools. Smoke filled the room. Virgil Hill grabbed Vivian McSparran, and she grabbed the baby, and they ran to the front door. It had been blown shut and was sealed, but they were able to force it open and escape. Charles Buckler ran out behind them. Both men suffered significant burns before getting out the door. A second time there was an explosion, this one blowing out the front windows of the tavern. Hill, a World War II veteran, later told reporters, "I've seen hell, but nothing like this." Everyone else who had been in the bar was trapped by a wall of flame and smoke that separated them from the front door. This shouldn't have been a problem. Several of them knew where the back door was and immediately went to it. When they got there, it wouldn't open. In a panic, they kept pressing up against it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked and barred and under additional pressure from the heat and press of bodies against it. But worse, despite laws that required otherwise, the door only swung inward. Meanwhile, the fire and smoke had spread through the interior of the tavern, up the walls and to the ceiling and to everything it could reach, bar stools, tables, the jukebox, and more. The small space quickly filled with black, acrid smoke. Flames leapt from blown-out windows and reached to the hotel rooms on the second floor. 6 of those were damaged, 3 had been occupied, but the hotel owners evacuated the occupants safely. Coleman ran across the street to the Pastime Tavern, where he asked the owner to give him a ride to the police station. The owner said his wife was about to drive their 9-year-old daughter home and asked her to take him. The owner recalled Coleman was out of breath, like someone had been chasing him. Coleman ordered a beer. Minutes after he set a fire to a bar full of people, he sat at another bar and drank a beer while he waited for a ride. Meanwhile, the owner saw the growing fire across the street and called police. Before leaving, Coleman told the owner, "I did that." The owner didn't realize until after his wife and daughter left, with Coleman in the back seat, what Coleman had meant by saying, "I did that," and that he had just sent his wife and daughter out with an arsonist. He called police a second time and learned that Coleman had arrived at the station and his family was safe. The owner's wife said that during the ride to the police station just a few blocks away, Coleman sat in the back of the car and said several times, "I love my wife. I love my wife." He also said something like, "Those sons of bitches hiding her from me all that time, and I always thought it, but I didn't know about them hiding her until today." At one point, they drove near a traffic officer, and Coleman shouted out the window to the officer, "She's going to take me over." The fire department arrived quickly, and the blaze was extinguished within about 40 minutes. Once firefighters were able to get inside the tavern, they found 2 bodies in the main room near the bar and called for police and the coroner. All 12 people that had been trapped inside the tavern had been killed. They had died of smoke and fire inhalation. Once the fire started, it had effectively blocked off the front of the building. The 4 people who got out had been between it and the door. Everyone else couldn't go that way and try to get out through the back. Accounts vary between saying that 6 or 8 of those who died in the fire were found on top of one another in the narrow hallway leading to the back door. Moberly was thrust into an unwanted spotlight. The story of the fire was front-page news not only in Missouri but nationwide. It's striking, too, how the scene was handled and the story was reported. The local paper ran photos that included shots of the bodies inside the tavern. One man told me he remembered being about 13 and standing outside the back door, watching as the victims were removed, covered only with sheets. No one ushered him away. He said he'll never forget the way some of them were positioned, their arms still outstretched. It's hard to imagine that today such photos would have been printed and that the scene would not have been more secure. I'll take a break in the story here to look at some other things going on around the country at the same time as this fire happened. I like to try and put things into more context that way. Now, the fire again happened on February 16, 1968. On February 1st of that year, a South Vietnamese general and chief of the National Police executed a Viet Cong officer on a Saigon street. A photo of the moment of the execution is taken by AP photographer Eddie Adams and later won a Pulitzer Prize, and the photo became one of the most famous and influential images of the Vietnam War. Also on February 1st, the U.S. minimum wage was increased from $1.40 an hour to $1.60 an hour. Also on February 16th, the same day as the fire, NBC announced that Star Trek, previously slated for cancellation, had been renewed for a 3rd season, largely owing to an extensive letter-writing campaign by fans. On February 19th, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood made its nationwide debut on the National Education Television Network. On February 24th, Fleetwood Mac's eponymous debut album was released. On February 25th, 1968, the Khmer Rouge launched its first widespread campaign with simultaneous attacks on multiple military installations throughout Cambodia, seizing rifles and machine guns. And on April 4th of 1968, civil rights leader and minister Martin Luther King Jr. is fatally shot while standing on a balcony outside his room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The assassination sparked rioting in dozens of U.S. cities, while President Lyndon Johnson declared a national day of mourning on April 7th. Now we get back to the story. There was little doubt who was responsible for the fire at the Randolph Tavern. Few were surprised that Coleman was the suspect, especially among law enforcement. When the Randolph County Sheriff heard about the fire while out of town, he told his deputy, "Bet you $1 to a donut Bill Coleman did that." 24 charges were filed against Coleman the next day, one for each victim, or rather for each victim there was 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree murder by perpetration of arson. He told the judge at his arraignment, quote, "I am guilty of the fire, but murder? I'm not guilty of that. That was an accident." What wasn't clear was a motive. In the days following the fire, news coverage focused on the fact that Coleman was one on the list of those who couldn't be served in the Randolph, suggesting a belief that he set the fire in anger over not being served. A headline in San Diego declared, 12 die in cafe fire set by ousted patron. This didn't make sense to the owner, though, who told reporters he had discussed with Coleman the situation, that he had agreed to keep those who served prison terms out in order to reopen the troubled tavern. And he said Coleman understood and was all right with that. And remember, Coleman was one of the people who helped remodel the Randolph Tavern for the owner. Coleman was frequently moved out of Randolph County in the months following the fire. This was mostly because local residents were so shocked and angered that law enforcement was concerned there might be an attempt to lynch him. It was also because he tried to escape at least once, maybe twice. While he was held in the Randolph County Jail, the sheriff found out one of the bars on his cell had been sawed through. On another occasion, it looked as though he'd tried to dig through the floor at the base of the cell's toilet. Coleman spent a lot of this time awaiting trial alongside condemned men on death row at Missouri State Penitentiary. He would later complain about being shackled to a bed there. This could have been over escape attempts or because of behavioral issues. He reportedly attempted suicide 6 times. Coleman wrote to a Moberly Monitor Index reporter complaining about his multiple transfers and about being held in prison without being convicted of a crime. He even suggested he wanted the chance to go before a judge to plead guilty, saying it was the only way he could keep what sanity he had left. He never referenced the victims of the fire or any remorse at what had happened. His correspondence was always about him. Now, the case finally went to trial on September of 1969. Prosecutors focused on the murder charges in the death of only one person, the bartender, 60-year-old Geraldine Settles. The logic was that if they somehow failed to obtain a conviction, or if Coleman got off lightly, there would be 11 more opportunities to prosecute him. At the trial, authorities relied primarily on the testimony of Vivian McSparren, the woman who had been sitting in the bar with the baby when Coleman came in with the gasoline. She testified that she had seen him come in, sling the gas, and light it. The 2 men who had escaped the tavern with her, Virgil Hill and Charles Buckler, testified they had seen Coleman come in with the bucket and throw the gas, but neither had seen him light it. Other testimony for the prosecution focused on Coleman's activities in the hour before the fire. In addition to being in and out of the pastime multiple times and the Randolph Tavern twice, he had visited at least 2 other taverns that day, one in Moberly and one in Huntsville. He also visited friends at a trailer court west of Moberly, where he negotiated the purchase of a car and tried to buy a gun. At all of these stops, he made the same inquiry. He asked if anyone knew where his wife was. He had missed her by a few hours at Pappy's Tavern in Huntsville. That appears to be the closest he came to finding her. The prosecution's main focus was to establish that Coleman had deliberately set the fire. Secondarily, its arguments suggested that his motive had more to do with his efforts to find his estranged wife and a belief that people in the Randolph were hiding her from him. Other men testified that while Coleman was with them in the hours before the fire, he told them, quote, "When I leave this town, they're going to remember me. I'm going to make history." And, quote, "It may be the last time you see me. They are hiding my wife, and they'll be sorry." Now, even though Coleman said at his arraignment 19 months before that he was guilty of the fire, but the deaths had been accidental, his attorney's argument at the trial was that the fire had been an accident. Coleman's story was that he had damaged the transmission of a car he'd borrowed, and he was looking for the car's owner so the two could work on it. He said he got the gasoline for washing grease and oil off their hands, tools, and parts. He said he went to the Randolph Tavern looking for his friend, and while walking there with the bucket of gasoline, some of it splashed on his shirt sleeve. Coleman claimed when he entered the bar, McSparren lit a cigarette and then threw her match, hitting his arm and setting the sleeve on fire. He said this caused him to jerk his arm, slinging the gas around and spreading the fire. Coleman said after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the police station because he knew authorities would want to talk to him about the fire. The defense tried to attack McSparren's credibility, noting that she was facing bad check charges that later landed her in the Missouri Women's Prison and that she might have wanted to get on the county prosecutor's good side. It also attempted to prove that she was afraid she would be blamed for the fire. The defense even tried to call into question whether Settles had died in the fire, proposing that the body identified as hers was so badly burned there was no way to be certain it was her. To the defense's surprise, McSparren testified that she had quit smoking about a month before the fire, and Hill and Buckler backed her up. Trial testimony revealed that Coleman and McSparren were in the Randolph County Jail at the same time after she had resumed smoking. The prosecutors argued it was then that Coleman came up with the story blaming her, not knowing that she wasn't smoking at the time of the fire. Even though it still wasn't completely clear what Coleman's motive was, jurors were convinced he was responsible. After only 2.5 hours of deliberation, They found him guilty and sentenced him to death. The court set a date of January 25th, 1970, for him to die in Missouri's gas chamber, which, by the way, was at Missouri State Penitentiary. Coleman filed appeal after appeal. He accused his attorney of failing to call witnesses that would have backed up his story, and he claimed one juror should have been disqualified after making statements months before the trial that Coleman shouldn't even get a trial. All these arguments were rejected. He also tried to argue that the news coverage of the fire ensured that he couldn't get a fair trial in Randolph County. About this point, appeals judges asked why he never sought a change of venue to another county. This argument was also rejected. Coleman was once again taken to death row at Missouri State Penitentiary, this time as one of its condemned inmates. His appeals were still ongoing at the time, but it looked like he could eventually be one of those to die in the gas chamber. Then in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Furman versus Georgia that all the various states' methods of carrying out the death penalty employed in the U.S. were cruel and unusual, and they were struck down. Coleman's sentence was commuted to life in prison. He had gotten a reprieve, but that wasn't enough for him. He still fought to get out, filing multiple appeals. In one filed in 1991, he again challenged the witnesses that were called to testify and the fact that some people he wanted called had not been. Again, his arguments were rejected. While he was in Moberly to appear in court for that appeal, he talked to a newspaper reporter about what job he worked at MSP, about his cell in the ancient Housing Unit 4, the prison's oldest still-standing cell block, and what he liked to do for recreation. He bemoaned the fact that he never had any visitors. He still said nothing about being sorry for the 12 people who had died or to take responsibility for the fire. He posed for a photo and talked only about himself. To this day, even though we can surmise, it isn't known what Coleman's motive was. He died in prison at the Farmington Correctional Center in 2005 at the age of 72. He had never again admitted to deliberately starting the fire and never expressed remorse for what he'd done or the people he'd killed. Therefore, he never said why he did it. Coleman clearly had a violent streak, given that his record included assault, and he admitted to breaking down a door in a prison riot. But what caused him to set a fire to a bar he had helped renovate, while it was full of people, while it was owned by his friend, and most of the people inside had been his friends? Two of the women and the baby who were in the bar when he started the fire had ridden with him to Moberly from the trailer park, where he went to buy a car and a gun. One of them, Barbara Cribbs, had spoken to him on the sidewalk in front of the tavern less than an hour before he started the fire that killed her. It seems clear he was trying to find his wife, and it does seem that she was avoiding him and that some of the people in the Randolph that day knew where she was and might have been trying to help her avoid him. When one reporter managed to track her down weeks after the fire, she told him that Coleman had been beating her up and drinking frequently. Now, the couple had been separated for about 3 weeks at the time of the fire. Coleman claimed he wanted to find her only because he still had belongings of hers in their apartment in Macon, and he wanted to talk to her about getting moved out of it so he could quit paying the rent. Even if he was looking for her, it still didn't explain why he started the fire. Did he think she was in the tavern at the time and he wanted to kill her? After the fact, he didn't seem to think she was dead since he kept asking for her while he was in custody. Was he mad at the people inside? Had he actually intended to kill anyone? Why did he immediately go to the police? Now, all these questions remain, but the fact is, what matters is that 12 people died. Many of the people born in the 50-plus years that have passed since the tavern fire don't remember it, or the levee, or Bill Coleman. The levee is all but gone, and the old depot was torn down and replaced with a park featuring a Pullman rail car and a clock tower. Few people realized that the place where Moberly's City Hall stands today was once one of the bawdiest places in town and beyond, let alone the scene of such a tragedy. Many don't know that the tavern fire became a focal point in legal battles, reinforcing codes that require doors and bars to swing outward, or requiring that gas can only be bought in approved containers. What should be remembered is that on that Friday afternoon in 1968, 12 families were changed forever. 12 innocent people died, leaving behind dozens of loved ones and friends from whom they shouldn't have been taken. All of them left behind stories. Barbara Cribbs was only 29 when she died, and she was raising 6 children. Ruby Durbovin had 2 sons and a husband waiting for her at home. She and her mother-in-law, Ella Mae Durbovin, met at the tavern to wait for a ride home after both of them had gotten off work at a local nursing home. Ella Mae had 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Silas Crutchfield had a son and a daughter. James Lowry had 2 daughters. James Rockwood left behind his mother and 6 siblings. At least 3 people in the tavern that day had survived World War II, only to die unexpectedly in a place where they should have been able to pass the time in complete and careless safety. Geraldine Settles was supposed to get off work at 4 p.m., roughly 5 minutes after the fire was started. She had started work at the bar 4 days earlier. Her 60th birthday was 6 days earlier. Unfortunately, not much was ever written about these 12 people outside of those newspaper articles, but they were more than names. George Doherty, Jerry Ronimus, Clell Frederick, Elbert Smith, Albert Scholl. Let's hope they are remembered not only for how their lives were so cruelly and needlessly ended that day, but because they were more than how they died. But there is one other victim to remember. By most accounts, Bill Coleman's wife disappeared from the Moberly area after the events related to the fire. She had been subpoenaed to testify in the trial, but was never called to the stand. No one I spoke to today knows where she is or what happened to her. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one reporter for the St. Louis Globe did catch up to her weeks after the fire, and I imagine she wasn't happy about being approached, but she did talk to him. She told him she had left Coleman 18 days before the fire because he was beating me up all the time and drinking, and we were always arguing, she said. As for Coleman's continuing quest to speak to her after the fire, his wife told the reporter she had nothing to say to him. She hoped he wasn't executed, but as far as she was concerned, he didn't exist. He wrote in his article that some in Moberly blamed her for the fire. One man told him it never would have happened if she hadn't left him. Now, one domestic violence advocate told me in particular that gave her chills. Now, Jennifer Carter Dockler is the public policy director with the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and someone I have interviewed numerous times in past years and have come to rely on and consider a friend. She sat down with me for an interview about this case. Quote, usually the most common question we're asked is, why didn't this person who was being abused leave? And so the question is polar opposite, Carter Dockler told me. She said Coleman's behavior in abusing her and then searching for her and his history of violent crimes makes clear that she had little choice but to leave. Now again, I quote, no matter what, this is going to be a bad outcome, because we've got an individual in Bill Coleman who has a very scary tendency. I don't think it would have been realistic to expect her to just take beatings for the rest of her life until she dies. That's not fair. That's not right, Carter Dockler told me. She notes that this happened at a time when there were no domestic abuse shelters or hotlines with people trained in how to help Coleman's wife get away from him. The general attitude toward domestic violence in the 1960s and 70s was that it was a private family matter to be kept quiet, and the community should not be involved in dealing with it. It was fortunate for her then that she was able to find friends who did help her. Carter Dockler was also struck by the fact that at least one tavern owner said Coleman's wife was not allowed in the establishment until the couple reconciled. But he let Coleman in. Quote, it was as if she's supposed to fix it. How is she supposed to fix this other person's behavior? Said Carter Dockler. She said at least some in the community seemed to ostracize Coleman's wife rather than recognize the danger she was in and rally behind her. In the article, Coleman's wife also expressed surprise at what he'd done, saying she thought he might try to kill her, but she never thought he would try to kill anyone else. Carter Dachtler suspects that his wife must have felt a great deal of guilt over the fire and the deaths it caused, though she was not responsible. This was another part of the story that made her feel great empathy for Coleman's wife. As one bartender said in the same Globe article, she came into his establishment sometime after the fire and tried to talk about it, but he said he didn't want to discuss it. So, he said, she had a beer and sat by herself. She had to sit alone, quote, because she has no more friends. They're all dead, end quote. As a Moberly native, I want to say that the attitudes toward domestic violence presented in that Globe article are not the ones Sorry. Sorry, that was hard to read. As a Moberly native, I want to say that the attitudes toward domestic violence presented in that Globe article are not the ones I encountered growing up. Dachtler adds that attitudes today are very different from those in the 60s and the 70s and those heard in this article in Moberly and elsewhere. In fact, like many communities around the state, Moberly has a domestic violence shelter that is supported by the local community, but it is always in need of something. Now, find listings of those shelters at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence's website. Go to mocadsv.org. That's mocadsv.org. You'll also find links on the show. You'll also find links on the Show Me Murder Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds when I post this episode. Those needing help can find resources there, or by calling the national hotline, 800-799-7233. That's also going to be posted on our social media sites. And finally, my full interview with Jennifer about this case will be posted around the same time that I post this episode. So I encourage you to give that a listen as well. So that is the show. I want to thank you again for being a part of this broadcast tonight and for being interested in my podcast. And again, I am in the process now. I started on Monday uploading this to Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. And I'm working on Apple. If I can figure out how to get a couple of loopholes Apple has, I'll upload it to iTunes or whatever they're calling it today. I'll put it on there as well. But again, in the next few days, weeks, I hope it won't be more than a few weeks at most. You should find it on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. And again, I'm working on Apple. But I am in the process now of uploading this podcast and getting it launched. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The first season, I'll tell you, I should have said this at the beginning of the podcast, the first season, I'm calling it, is only 7 episodes. I'll tell you, folks, and those of you who have already talked to me, you know this, it's a lot of work to put an episode like this together the way I want to do it. And the way I like to do things typically means a lot of research, a lot of writing, and a lot of detail, but it's time consuming. So I've only done 7 episodes so far. I'm already picking the cases and starting the groundwork for the second season. So it'll be a while after these first 7 episodes are uploaded. It'll be a while before the second batch is uploaded. So I hope you'll stick with me and keep an eye out for that second season. And again, I hope you'll find Show Me Murder on those upload sites as well as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Please tell your friends, tell your family, especially anybody you think would be interested in this. And I hope more people will, the more support I get, the more I'm going to be able to do with this. I love doing it. I've had a blast doing this research. I've had a blast meeting many of the people who were on the feed tonight and watching this video. And the more support I get, the more I'm going to be able to do. And at some point, hopefully this will even make some money, and that'll make it easier to justify the time I put into it. So that's a lot of babbling from me. Thank you for being on this broadcast tonight, and I hope that you will continue to look for this podcast again. Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I think everybody watching this video knows how to reach me. So thanks for being a part of this tonight. This was fun.